Take our minds and think through them. Take our mouths and speak through them. Take our hands and work through them. And take our hearts and set them on fire for Christ's sake. Amen. So who doesn't love St. Francis of Assisi? Right? Even his Pope, who he challenged, Gregory IX, who presided over the vast wealth and power of the Roman Church in the 12th century, was won over by him. Francis was an unlikely candidate for a saintly life. The son of a wealthy cloth merchant, he spent his youth with all the trappings of upper-class privilege, partying, rabble-rousing, womanizing. He went off to battle, imagining glory as a soldier. But eventually he returned home, disillusioned and humbled. He stripped himself of his worldly power and possessions, even his clothes on one occasion, to live in service and in solidarity with the poor. He also cultivated a profound connection to the earth and God's creatures. Francis was bold, yet humble. He challenged the Roman hierarchy just as the church had reached unprecedented heights of power and wealth. And he and his ragtag group of followers came closer than almost any other community to embodying the non-possessive and self-giving ethos of the early apostles, as illustrated today in our reading from Acts. Like today, the gap between the privileged and the impoverished was stark and overwhelming. Francis had rebuilt old dilapidated churches that were symbols of the one great church that was falling into ruin. Not because it was poor and decimated, but because it had forgotten what its core mission was: serving the poor, the sick, the marginalized, proclaiming light, love, and beauty, not just through beautiful trappings of power and wealth with interiors and stained glass windows and altars of carved wood or stone, but through intimate relationships of care and fellowship that made people know they were loved and that they belonged. Francis went to Rome in his humility and begged in solidarity with the poor. And he managed, through raw, simple nerve, to arrange an audience with the Pope. A nobody meeting with the Pope. Francis's work and his holiness was so evident in his own day that he was honored with sainthood within 2 years of his death. And he's appropriately honored in our own day by the current Pope who has taken on his name, and by millions of ordinary people around the world who honor him by taking on his spirit. Leaving the comforts of the city and retreating to the wilds outside of the town walls, Francis was surrounded by the creatures of the land, forest, and air, and he shared their vulnerability and the simplicity of their needs and demands. Those creatures cultivated in him a deeper compassion than almost any figure in human history. Too often, humanity has perverted the biblical call to rule over or, quote, subjugate nature as an excuse to exploit and abuse. But Francis showed us that, like us, animals are also subjects of the divine, not objects. They're a reflection of divine life. not things created solely for our use and abuse. For the most part, human beings have shunned such humility and exercised consistent power over the land and its creatures. We've often abused that power, depleting the land of its nutrients, polluting our air and water, destroying entire ecosystems, and on top of it, turning God's creatures into objects of sport or outlets for cruelty, or caged and brutalized objects harvested for their flesh. So one of the ways we celebrate the memory of St. Francis every year is to pay special attention to the simplest, most humble, and vulnerable of God's creatures, our pets and our livestock. I heard an amen back there. They are as vulnerable to us humans as the poor have been to the rich, and as the rich, and today we have offer thanks and blessings for the animals that grace our lives. From the very beginning, God has called us to be companions and stewards of the divine creation, caretakers of this world, God's world. And God's covenant with us, and indeed all of creation, has always been that I am a God of life, not destruction. A God of abundance, not scarcity. So I think one of the lessons for us in this is that if we can't live out lives of care and generosity with the earth and its most simple and vulnerable of creatures, how can we hope to live such lives, our lives out in communities of complex, frustrating, and challenging people? In Luke's Gospel, Jesus illustrated this challenge in the story of the man in the crowd who shouted out his request to Jesus to make his brother divide his family inheritance and give him his due portion, as if it was something owed him. It was a request born out of greed, rooted in a scarcity mentality, and Jesus told the man and the crowd to be on guard against such a mindset. And he illustrated it with the parable about the rich man who, despite his abundance, rather than feel grateful and generous, felt the need to create ever greater storehouses to contain his abundance. In fact, the rich man was so self-centered, it was so self-centered that he, rather than asking for God's guidance and wisdom as to what he should do with this abundance, he talks to his own soul. Was he afraid of what God, much less what his neighbors might suggest? Nevertheless, we can see from the life of St. Francis of Assisi that God can work in all of us life-giving and life-affirming transformations, no matter what our background, no matter how simple or marginalized those transformations may seem for our lives. And yet we often struggle with those transformations because we're so afraid of not being in control. We create false categories that separate ourselves from one another and from the rest of God's creation. We define ourselves as Jews or Gentiles, circumcised or uncircumcised. We may be CEOs or day laborers. We may be priests or lay people, rich or struggling, immigrants or native born, gay people or straight people, dog people or cat people, Protestant, Catholic, Hindu, Buddhist. But no matter who we are, Francis helped show how we are all one in God's sight. And we're invited to claim that truth in our ministries, in our value as children of God, and let no one diminish our calling and the ownership of our faith and our church. Lord, help us learn from these creatures that we love and have brought with us this day, these humble and vulnerable creatures with no guile or pretense, that depend totally on our grace and generosity of spirit, just the way we depend upon you, O Lord. And take these lessons and transform our hearts, that we might see and honor in each other the beauty, love, and grace that we see in them, and learn to walk with you freely, lightly, and humbly. Amen.